5 years ago, I wrote a book on courage. And I think it came from a conversation I had with a friend. We looked at our lives and we looked at things, when we didn't do what we thought was right, when we didn't take the chance when it came. We looked at people we've been working with. I've been working with leaders. She'd been coaching a lot of creative people, artists, musicians, writers. And the common theme we saw was that when you don't do something, you can have a million excuses. I don't have time, I don't have the money, what will people think, and so on. But it's a fear that is blocking. And we saw it in our own lives, we saw it in the people we worked with. So we wanted to explore that. We focused, we want to understand the fear, but we wanted to focus on courage. So what is courage? I think it's a great question to just ask yourself, because it's personal. What is courage to you? It's a great question to engage leaders in. What's courage to you? It's a great question to engage teams and organizations in. We chose a definition, which was courage is equal to fear plus action. So it's not about being unafraid and do things. That's quite easy. But it's actually about being afraid or fear or worried or nervous and do it anyways. The things we know it's right, the things that is connected to the higher purpose. And it's acting from the heart. Courage, as you may know, comes from cor in Latin, which means heart. It's actually, I like that a lot. It's coming from the heart. We asked people, we wanted to step outside of ourselves, so we interviewed people. We asked them, what are some of the fears or worries that you have in daily life? What are things you lay awake in the night, you can't sleep? What are you thinking about? What are these things you feel this knot in your stomach when you go to work? What are you thinking about? We had like 160 people rank the fears that affected them the most in everyday life. And these were leaders, these were other people as well. And the fear that most people ranked the highest was the fear of hurting or hurting other people, making them sad or disappointed. Then there were some deeper lying fears, which was about fear of not being good enough, not being sufficient, not being true to myself and my purpose, fear of losing control, things like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the dynamics of fear before you can, I think, really understand what it takes to be courageous. And we've all been courageous, but at the conscious level, I think we need to understand fear. And first of all, as we all know, it's human, right? Somebody said the most neglected fact in business is that we're human, right? So since we're human, there's going to be fear. And fear is not all bad, but we need to understand it so we're not driven by it. It doesn't take over, it doesn't take control. We're more than the fear. I think we touched upon fear quite a few times in different aspects, in different workshops. But of course, one thing connected to fear is survival. The fight, flight, or freeze mechanism is something that's been developed for us to be able to survive. And we need to just understand that and relate to that. We can't disconnect from it. It's a great mechanism when you want to run from a tiger or fight a hostile tribe. It's not as great when you look at your to-do list and you got into this fight or flight mode, or you worry about the meeting or whatever it is. There was a study at HP where they saw when people had more fear or got more stressed, their IQ dropped, and in this case about 10% on average. So we get less smart when we're afraid, and we all know that. We see that in teams, we see that in ourselves, leaders, organizations. We get less smart. The second thing is the programming. There was a famous psychiatrist called Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. Some of you may have read her work. And she said, you're born with two fears. Only two fears. One fear is the fear of falling. And the second fear is the fear of high-pitched sounds, high sounds. Having looked at my own children, I think we're born with another fear as well, which is being left alone, being left from the flock. But everything else is learned. So we learned a lot of fears, and some are great to learn, right? You put your hand on the stove and you burn yourself and you learn this is not a good thing. But then you enter a relationship and you get burned, and the learning may be, I'm never going to enter a relationship again, or I'm never going to open up like that again. And that will hinder us. So the programming, and this is also cultural, as you know, every system have their own programming. And we need to just recognize this. Third, there is always a deeper layer to fear. There is the surface level, which we may be aware of. Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to meet the deadline. And then you ask, what's going to happen if you don't meet the deadline? Well, then my boss will be disappointed. Okay, so what happens if your boss gets disappointed? Well, then he or she may not, like me, promote me, think good of me. What happens then? Then it becomes quite difficult to answer, but it has something to do with this, I think, very intrinsic human thing that we want to be liked and loved, and we want to feel significant, and we want to be part of a community. So to do something about fears, we need to understand what's going on far deep down the iceberg. And as I said before, the goal is not to get rid of this. I think it's inhuman not to be afraid. And this is also a job for us, I think, when we work with leaders in organizations. A lot of the organizations I meet are quite driven by fear. To be able to see that. If we truly want to change, we need to do something with that. So, let's leave fear for a while and talk about courage. What can we then do? What are the resources? I think we all have made a lot of courageous choices. That's why we're sitting here, I think. All of us. So what resources did we use? Maybe we didn't think of those resources consciously at the time. I think the first resource, we've talked about it already, is curiosity. The moment you become curious about your fear, it's not driving you. What is this all about? Where does it come from? Then we can change something, getting aware of it. The second thing is expansion. I read in Gandhi's autobiography, he was a lawyer, as you may know, and his first case, he dressed up in a very nice suit, he prepared himself, and he came to court, and it was his turn to speak. He stood up, and nothing came out of his mouth. He couldn't speak. He was paralyzed by fear. And I couldn't believe it when I read it. This man, who I perceive as one of the most courageous people that have been around, was paralyzed by fear. So what did he do? One of the things he did, I think, he doesn't say this, but it's pretty obvious when you read the book and you know his story, is that he expanded his focus from himself to something greater. And the moment you do that, and I think we all do that from time to time, we're in contact with our purpose, we come back to our sort of ego, what are people going to think? We're back into contact with purpose again, and then back. But it was very obvious, he dedicated his life to what he called truth. It was beyond himself. And when it's beyond myself, I can disconnect my ego, and there's not so much to be afraid of anymore. What are people going to think? Well, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, but it's not the whole thing. It's not what life is about. And I think a very practical thing that I think a lot about is to switch my focus from what can I get in a certain situation to what can I give. And theoretically, it's easy. But since we all have these egos saying, for instance, I'm standing here, I'm sometimes thinking, what will they think about this? What are you thinking? So that's what can I get from you? I want the confirmation from you, perhaps. But switching that to what can I give? If I do my best, given the situation, what can I give? There's nothing to worry about. It's such a big shift, and I think a lot about that when I go into situations where I'm nervous. Okay, go from get to give. Because that's expanding. Fear closes our vision, right? It's the tunnel visioning. We don't see clearly, really. We don't see the whole picture. It's impossible to see the whole system when you're scared. So expanding. Thirdly, and I'm going to talk about 5 things. Thirdly is cross the border. And you have done this many, many times. And the border of what? Your zone of comfort, right? We've all done this many, many times. And I think the good thing to be aware of is just that it's just part of life. It's natural. And it's always going to be a little bit of discomfort doing that. And when I realized there's always going to be a little bit of discomfort, it was easier to do it somehow. Whether it's speaking up in a certain situation, whether it's making a certain life choice, whether it's actually challenging a leader that you're working with, taking a little, of course, calculated risk in doing that for something you believe in. These are things we do every day. It's like a creative dance. Some things are small, some things are big. But I'm sure most of us every day has a choice. Shall we, step out a little bit outside our comfort zone, or shall I stay? And I sometimes stay, and sometimes I'm not so proud of staying, and sometimes I walk out and it feels great. What happens? It expands. And if we're not stepping out at all, what happens with the zone? It shrinks, yeah. Suddenly you start worrying about small stuff that was previously no big deal. So it's like a muscle. We need to practice this muscle all the time. It's the muscle of courage. Then, the 4th thing I would like to bring up is discipline. We need this mental, emotional discipline, because many times when we get really, really afraid or we fear things, it's the pictures that we get into our mind and the inner monologue and the thoughts that take over. When I was in 9th grade, there was a girl called Karen, and she was going to present at the board in some topic. She walks up to the board, and she is green in her face, this green pale color. She stands behind the desk. She says 2 words, and then she passes out. And whatever was going on in her was obviously something. She had these very, very negative pictures and messages that actually drove her to pass out. So we have to be. I think this requires discipline, because we're trained to look for threats, these survival mechanisms. It's very easy to see what can go wrong, but we need to balance that also, putting in helpful pictures. And that's discipline. And also be aware of the impermanence, as you were talking about. It passes, these things. The 5th, I think, is the most important one. Even if you do all these other things, you need faith. Without faith, dealing with fear is like, if you go to an amusement park and there is games where you have the frogs come up and you have like a club and you bang down the frog. So it's like that, it's one fear. I bang it down. There's another one coming up and I bang it down, because there is no underlying faith in life and myself. Have you ever been worrying about something for some time, maybe a few weeks, some months? Suddenly you're out walking by yourself, and then from nowhere comes this inspiration that says, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. And you just relax. Have you ever experienced that? Yeah. And that's, to me, that's coming back to faith. Because we don't know if it's going to be okay, but it's the choice we make there. We choose to believe that, because it's the best thing we can do. So building and cultivating faith and recognizing when we lost faith in life and ourselves is important, I think. So these are just a few resources that you already use, I'm sure, but you can also consciously explore them, and you can engage in dialogues around them also with for instance, coaching clients. So just to summarize this, I really think we engage in this, I call it the creative dance between fear and courage all the time. And to me, courage is not about pushing away the fear. It's actually, being with it, accepting it, but also accessing other resources so we're bigger, so we can go beyond. Connecting back to the trends, there's a lot of work to do, and you're part of that, we're all part of that, and it requires a lot of courage. So thank you.